James Cleverly, welcome to the Spectator's leadership hustings. Obviously, we're doing you individually this time around. We don't want any yellow cards appearing. To begin, please could you give us your 2-minute opening statement on why you should be the next leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, what we've got to recognise is what went wrong last time and what we need to do different next time. And at the last election, and indeed elections leading up to the general election in the summer of this year, we saw a load of infighting. We saw the party drift away from its core values, and we saw the party communicate and carry itself, I think, in a really negative and overly defensive tone. So my proposition is that we need to do the opposite of those things. We need to be disciplined, we need to be unified, we need to be focused. We need to unify around core conservative values, which I've held in my head and heart my entire adult life. And we need to communicate in a fundamentally different way, a much more optimistic, positive, upbeat, engaging way. And in all those things, I think I'm the best placed to do that. I've got the most experience. I'm the most experienced communicator on behalf of the party, and I have been a solidly small state, low tax, less regulation Conservative my whole life.
Why do you think the Tories lost the 2024 election?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. We lost the ear of the British public. They stopped listening to us. I think we had overpromised and underdelivered on a load of issues, which meant that when we came into the general election with new promises, we were met with real cynicism. And people had literally closed their ears, their minds to our arguments. So even if we'd had the best policy platform in the world, people weren't willing to give us the time of day. I think that if we make fewer promises, but make sure we deliver on all of those promises, we will regain the trust of the British people, and that means being disciplined. It's about being honest that the government can't and indeed shouldn't attempt to solve every problem in people's lives. That we give people responsibility and freedom. We do fewer things but do them much better, and we reduce the regulatory and tax burden on both people and businesses. And I think that's got to be the sales pitch that we take into the next general election.
And just a brief one on the election gone before we talk about the election to come, which is, do you think the election result would have been much different if Rishi Sunak had waited until the autumn? Perhaps right now, instead of having a Tory leadership hustings, we'd be talking about the coming campaign.
Sliding door moment conversations are great for dinner parties, but we are where we are. Look, I
suppose it's a serious point in the sense do we think that the problems are so fundamental, there wouldn't have been too big a difference between going and so, or lots of things went wrong because of the timing, or actually the party had lost so much trust that it didn't really matter if we waited a couple of months or not?
So my understanding, and I've not grilled Rishi about this, but my understanding was the belief was that the national insurance contribution cuts, which were basically tax cuts, didn't get the kind of cut through that we were expecting. The reduction in inflation wasn't having the positive impact that we were expecting. The bottom line was the good news was not cutting through, but the bad news was. And there was, I believe, and I wasn't in on the detailed conversations around this, I don't think anyone around the cabinet table was, the belief was the longer it went on, if people ignore the good news and focus on the bad news, all you're doing is accumulating more political barnacles on the boat. I found that frustrating because in August, after the election, we had a whole load of migration figures released. And in the area that I was responsible for, every single one of those metrics was heading in the right direction. Net migration was coming down. Applications were down. The grant rates had reduced. Deportation numbers had increased. So on all the things I was responsible for, there would have been good news. But as I say, if the British people just weren't ready to listen to us or weren't willing to listen to us, waiting for more bits of good news, I don't necessarily believe would have made a difference.
Now, the last Tory leadership election, I think it was quite clear when we did these hustings that the dividing line was really on tax. It dominated a lot of the contest. In this leadership election, what do you think the dividing line is?
I think a lot of it is about what we think the next job of the Conservative Party is. I've literally just come from a council by-election in Soho, mile from here. And there are Conservatives who are fighting to get elected at the moment. There'll be Conservatives fighting to get elected at local government level in spring next year. The Labour Party is messing up at a rate that I don't think any of us expected. There is a real opportunity for us to take advantage of that if we hit the ground running immediately. Now, I think the dividing line is, do we need or want a protracted period of analysis, belly button gazing, soul searching, or do we want to get back on the front foot immediately, straight out the traps? My argument is that whilst it might be tempting for us in Westminster to lick our wounds and have a belly button gazing exercise for a few years, there are Conservatives across the country who need us to be on the front foot now. And I think that's why I believe I'm in the strongest position, because I've run big government departments. I've run CCHQ during a general election campaign. I'm the most experienced political media face and voice of the Conservative Party. And I know that I can hit the ground running right from minute one. And I don't think we have any time to lose. And I think that's the big dividing line. Who is ready to lead now? Not after a probationary period, not after some time learning on the job. Who can do it today? And I know that I'm the most experienced person and therefore the best place to lead right from the get-go.
It's almost to keep calm and carry on.
No, it's not keep calm. No. It's definitely not continuity anything. We've got to do things fundamentally differently. And the point that I have made in the stump speeches is we've got to start doing something we haven't done for a very, very long time, which is actually promoting conservative values and philosophy. I can't remember the last time we sold the concept of conservatism. We need to start communicating effectively. You can't hide from the media as leader of the opposition. You need a really effective communicator. And I think Rishi would, admit that he wasn't the most polished political communicator, and he was competing with Nigel Farage for someone who is a natural communicator. And I think the lesson we need to take from that is we need to get back into the habit of communicating effectively. So it is a fundamental change in what we have done, but we don't, as I say, we don't have the luxury of hanging around for a couple of years to learn those lessons.
So if you become Tory leader, will we be seeing you say yes to all media requests as they come in? No show a step too far.
Well, I've never shied away from either personally being scrutinised or being the person who fronts up the scrutiny of the Conservative Party or the Conservative government. And particularly when you're in opposition, you don't have the levers of the state. You don't have many things to demonstrate your wares other than your ability to communicate. And if you're not willing to take every opportunity to sell conservatism, then you're doing it wrong, because no one else is going to do it for us.
Now let's go through a few policy areas.
Okay.
I know you've already said a lot about the economy, so I thought one that we've been talking to with all the candidates is migration. Obviously, a former Home Secretary is in the room here. Robert Jenrick is clearly talking about leaving the ECHR.
Yeah.
Others are not saying go so far. How far do you think that the party needs to go to control migration? And do you think leaving the ECHR is a step too far?
So we have got to have a fundamental shift in the way we think about migration. The OBR analysis now shows that migrants are not net contributors to the UK economy over the full time that they're here in the country. I've said that we should measure GDP per capita rather than overall GDP, because that will prevent the Treasury hiding slow growth under a curtain of large-scale immigration. With regard to the framework around the framework within which we operate our migration policies, I was struck by the fact a lot of European countries were much better than we had been in rejecting asylum applications and returning people to their country of origin. And these were other countries that were signatories of the ECHR. So the first thing I asked is, why are they better than us? What are they doing differently to us? And again, you look at the United States of America, which has a very activist legal system. They are not members of the ECHR, and yet they really struggle with deportations and returns. There are no silver bullet solutions to this. And anyone who is promising a silver bullet solution, I think, is slipping into the habit that we got into at the last Parliament, which is making big, bold promises that are not that easy to deliver. That's what got us in trouble in the first place. So let's not do that again. Now, the fact is, I was deporting foreign national offenders regularly. Under my watch, asylum application grant rates reduced. We were very successful in sending people back to Albania. We struck a deal with Vietnam where we would be increasing returns to Vietnam. So my thing is, don't look for excuses. Don't look for excuses. You got a job to do your job. Don't cry about not being able to do it. Okay.
And leaving the ECHR is perhaps more complicated than some suggest.
But also, it's like, don't say to the British people, oh, if this one thing changed, everything would be easy, because we've tried that before.
With Brexit?
No, with a whole load of things. I mean, just saying stuff is easy. Doing stuff is key. And the point was, when I was Foreign Secretary, in the 7 months that I was Foreign Secretary, those key indicators of success were heading in the right direction. And I did that within the legal framework. And it's about graft. And I've always been a grafter. And I think that's what the British people want to see. They don't want hollow promises. They want delivery.
Do you think there would have been a flight to Rwanda?
Yes.
When do you think it would have been?
I think it would have been going back end of July, maybe through to early August. And I tell you the reason.
And then once the election was called, was it just impossible logistically to have that during a campaign? Right?
It became technically impossible. There are a whole load of things where you needed to have both international partners and domestically a clear mandate. And the reason that we had sent a small number of people to Rwanda voluntarily was a proof of concept. The UK Supreme Court, not the ECHR, the UK Supreme Court, who had blocked the flights, their argument was that Rwanda was an inherently dangerous country for asylum seekers. The fact that we were sending asylum seekers to Rwanda undermined that argument, which would have meant that they would not have been able to successfully prevent future flights. So we had a plan. We were working through the plan. The Rwandans were working very, very, very well with us. And one of the things I'm still very, very angry about is the really arrogant way that the incoming Labour government treated a Commonwealth partner by briefing the papers that they were ripping up the agreement before they had the common courtesy to actually ring the Rwandan government and tell them directly.
And you would bring it back if you could?
Well, look, we'll need to see. I mean, the first question is, would Rwanda still want to work with us?
You'd call them at least.
Well, look, I still maintain good relations with a number of my former interlocutors.
Looking, I think, at other policy areas now, the environment is one where, obviously, in the past, vote blue, go green. Different leaders have leaned into it in different ways. But now you have the Reform Party really taking quite a sceptical approach to net zero with Nigel Farage. You look at some countries in Europe where parties on the right, some on the far right, are making gains through being net zero sceptical. How realistic do you think our current net zero goals are?
Well, we should recognise that we became one of the most powerful nations in the world because we had first mover advantage during the Industrial Revolution. The age of steam was our friend. We got to recognise the fact that there is a move away from hydrocarbon-based energy. How quickly that happens, it will be hard to tell. But we should be right at the front edge of innovation once again. When I was Foreign Secretary, I was promoting small modular nuclear reactors around the world. Yet in the UK, we have made it so slow and bureaucratic building any kind of new energy generation. So, for example, Hinkley C costing 6 times as much as a comparable nuclear power station in France, for example. Unbelievable. So we should be pushing the world to move away from hydrocarbons, but we should sell both our knowledge and our products. So we should use it as something that boosts the British economy, not have it as a drag anchor on British economy, and certainly not having it as something which adds to the cost of bills of British people. So yes, promote it on the world stage, which is what I did. But as I say, use it as a revenue stream rather than a drag anchor.
Okay, fine. So looking at foreign policy, obviously also, going back to your point of experience, a former foreign secretary Looking at, I suppose, the UK government's current foreign policy positions, are there any that you think need to change immediately?
Oh, well, under the Labour government, I am shocked by how quickly they're burning through our credibility on the world stage. So Keir Starmer and David Lammy flying to America, why? They had one job, which was to get the green light for Ukraine to use long-range missiles against the Russian launch sites, came back with nothing. Scrapping the arms export licenses to Israel, one of our key partners in the region, on the day that 6 hostages were being buried, alienating our key regional partner and also getting a telling off from the US in the process, putting a big question mark over our credibility as an international partner, turning back the clock and trying to rebuild through the back door a pre-Brexit relationship with the EU, whilst alienating fast-growing economies in the Indian subcontinent, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. I genuinely struggle to envisage a set of foreign policy activities that are less effective and more amateurish than the Labour government at the moment. So would I change stuff? Yes. Unfortunately, we don't have long enough for me to list all the things the Labour Party are currently getting wrong.
That would be the sequel.
That would be the sequel.
Did David Lammy...
The outtake, the editor's cut.
Exactly, the director's cut.
Director's cut, that's right.
Did David Lammy ever ask you for advice?
I wish he had. I'd have told him to not be so useless.
Okay, maybe he can see that here if he's looking for some. Now, some of your fellow candidates in this race, they have been quite sceptical, suggested there needs to be more caution on China. And one of the things that's come up is the wisdom of visiting China. Should there be more distance? You visited China as Foreign Secretary last year. Do you regret that? Was that the right move?
Yes, it was absolutely the right move.
So perhaps you're a bit more pragmatic on the issue than some of your colleagues?
No, again, this is it's a fundamentally back to front way of viewing it. China is an incredibly influential country, and you can't pretend that away. Much of China's behavior is totally unacceptable. Their internal treatment of dissenting voices and minority groups, including the Uyghur Muslims, totally unacceptable. Their aggressive posture across the Taiwan Strait, unacceptable. Their debt diplomacy, for want of a better word, trying to tie in developing countries through basically debt bondage, unacceptable. Their interference with Chinese diaspora communities around the world, including here in the UK, unacceptable. Their sanctioning of British parliamentarians, unacceptable. And when I went to China and looked Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, in the eyes, I told him that. And I was absolutely unflinching in my direct criticism of China in front of him. Of course, he made his excuses. You would expect that. But diplomacy isn't a favor. You don't do it only to your mates. And if all you do is wrap yourself up in the artificial comfort blanket of your pre-existing relationships, you will lose influence on the world stage. And pretending China is not there, or standing on the periphery and shouting, again, that's not how you get results. So going to China was absolutely the right thing to do. Confronting them directly over the areas where we demand they change their behavior, absolutely important. Nothing changes overnight, particularly with a country like China, but pretending they don't exist or just, standing on the touchline shouting is not the way you exert influence on the world stage.
Now, moving to America, in a couple of weeks' time, we, of course, have the US presidential elections. I know you love hypothetical questions,
No.
so
Give you a hypothetical answer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, please do. If you could vote, who would you vote for, or would you abstain?
Look, I'm not going to do this because the bottom line is I've worked when I was at the Foreign Office. I've worked with both Biden's administration. I've worked with Trump's administration, And in the UK, we are duty bound, I think, on behalf of the British people to make sure we have a really good working relationship with the United States of America under whatever president. And I mean, one of the things that really strikes me, and this is why I'm not going to get drawn on these kind of hypotheticals, our current foreign secretary has performatively been rude about Donald Trump. And if President Trump is the winner at the next general election, I don't know how David Lammy can credibly be the face and voice of the British government in the White House. And the foolishness of trying to get clicks and likes on social media by alienating the potential leader of one of our closest allies in the world is childish beyond belief. And that's why I'm not going to get drawn into these hypotheticals, because it doesn't, makes good content for a podcast, but makes bad diplomacy.
This is not a hypothetical. So it's quite clear Keir Starmer is considering a vote on assisted dying. He has said as much, potentially through a private member's bill. And I just wondered, where do you sit on this issue? Clearly it's a conscience vote, so it's not something where your position would have to be the party's if you were leader. But as well, how are you approaching it?
Yeah, look, this is not a hypothetical, because I have voted on this in the past, and I voted against this. I voted against assisted dying. I'm not a religious person at all. It's not anything to do with religious conviction, but it worries me the pressure that would implicitly be put on older people. We know that a lot of older people, very much from that kind of, they come from that generation where they don't want to be a burden. They're the least likely to call an ambulance if they fall. They say, "Oh, I don't want to cause problems." And the last thing that I would want is for people like that to be self-pressurized into killing themselves or being killed. I mean, let's not. Assisted dying is someone killing someone else, and that might be something that others are comfortable with. I'm not comfortable with that. And that's why I voted against it in the past. And look, and until we've got a real step change in palliative care, until we make end of life better using the tools that we already have at our disposal, I am very, very, very uncomfortable starting on what I think would be potentially a slippery slope towards euthanasia.
Now I've got two more, and then we're going to rattle through some very quick ones. So the light at the end tunnel is emerging. I suppose just on NHS and NHS reform, I wondered, is Wes Streeting possibly the person who can do the things the Tories can't do when it comes to probably some of the reforms that I think in the past I often heard Tory politicians talk about, but they're really worried about voter perception?
Well, if you love an institution like the NHS. My mum worked in the NHS her whole life. I was born in Lewisham Hospital, as were my sons. Susie was treated for her breast cancer through the NHS. So, understandably, like many Brits, I've got a real soft spot for the NHS. But because I love it so much, I want to make sure that it is a highly functioning organisation. And the bottom line is that the economics of our health system are on the verge of breaking. We have put huge amounts of money into the NHS, and yet we still have real challenges. I think a lot of the money is spent in the wrong places. We are very good at keeping people unwell but alive for a very, very long time. We're very bad at preventative actions. We're very bad at screening. We're very bad at early diagnosis. If we put more time, effort and money into that end of the equation, I think it'd be more sustainable. So yes, reform is absolutely key. If Wes Streeting can, fight the unions, and early indicators are that they're just going to roll over and get their tummies tickled by the people that pay their campaign funds. But if he can buck the trend and actually get the NHS into a good, sustainable position, I think we should back him. I'm not holding my breath because, as I say, the early actions of the Labour government show that they are, very, very weak on this kind of stuff.
It looks as though Labour is cracking down on free speech, or the free speech bill of the Tories, but more broadly online. We've had the riots, and there was a big debate. Obviously, the Tories brought in the online safety bill. There were some Conservative voices criticising at the time on free speech grounds. And that's now being looked at again in terms of whether you can strengthen it by the Labour government. And I just wondered, where do you sit on that balance between freedom of expression online and legal but harmful type content, and Elon Musk really, because I think lots of people talk about X and how it has become, some will say it's become a place of free speech recently, others say it's become more dangerous. Where do you sit on that?
So I'm a big believer in freedom of speech. I think it's incredibly important. And I've been foreign secretary. I've been to parts of the world where freedom of speech is very, very, very heavily curtailed, and that is not a future that we want to trend towards. Freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of consequence, and there are lots of things that you can say or do, but if you're then upset about the consequences of your actions, then you should be more thoughtful before you post. But inevitably on these things, the Labour Party is already trending in a rather nasty authoritarian direction, because if you're not willing to let people say things that you don't like, then it's not really freedom of speech. It is the management of speech, and that's not where we should be. And with regard to X, I mean, like Elon Musk bought what was then Twitter and set about changing it because his perception was that Twitter was silencing right of centre voices. And, a lot of people like having their thumb on the scales as long as the scales are weighed in their favour. And of course, when someone comes along with perhaps a bigger thumb and pushes harder on the other side of the scale, then suddenly everyone cries foul. So be very, very careful about curtailing voices that you disagree with, because you might not always be the ones in charge of who gets to speak and who doesn't.
Yeah. And there's a question actually on Tory policy on that. It's often felt a bit to me. So some of the Tory plans, whether it's smoking or things, is people think it's fine because it's when the Tories are in control, they can decide the things. And then, of course, you don't know who's going to take over after.
Well, look, and this is the thing. You got to, it's almost like analogous to removing the veil of ignorance. If you're going to start putting limiting legislation on the statute books, the first question you should ask is, how would I feel if a Corbyn-style Labour government had the tools at their disposal that I'm now putting on the statute books? And if that sets off alarm bells, you should really think very, very carefully about codifying those things.
Final quick questions to end this. Looking back on the past 14 years, which leaders do you take the most inspiration from? Is there a specific one that you think you can learn the most from? You've obviously served under quite a few.
Well, I've maintained good relations with all the party leaders and prime ministers. I think it's a very arrogant and foolish person that thinks they can't learn anything from their predecessors. So I have chatted with, had phone calls with, or meetings with almost all my predecessors. Look, I'm not.
Almost. That means all.
No, I think all. I think I've had fairly recent conversations with all the living party leaders or former prime ministers.
And looking back on those past 14 years, what do you think is the most conservative policy that was delivered in that time? And I'm presuming that by that one that you particularly support, or like your party did.
So I'm really impressed with what Ben Houchin is doing up on Tees Valley. And I think that really is a model. So I grew up in Southeast London, looking over the river at Canary Wharf, rising like a phoenix from the former disused docks, through having a lower taxation and low regulatory environment. I'm now looking at what Ben is doing in Tees Valley, and he is replicating that model in the northeast rather than the southeast, and having a similar result, sucking in international investment, building jobs, transforming a previously industrial area into something really modern and exciting. And I think that's the thing that we should be doing right across the board. So instead of taxing and subsidizing, what we should be looking at doing is reducing taxes and deregulating and boosting boosting our economic prosperity that way.
And in contrast, what's the least conservative policy of the past 14 years?
Look, I suppose all of us got to recognise that our response to COVID was inherently And I understand why the decisions were made at the time. And, I was in government, but I wasn't around the cabinet table. And we took a very, very interventionist, not just economically interventionist through furlough, which I completely understood. And it kept people's roofs above their head and kept a lot of businesses afloat. But the social restrictions that we introduced, I think all of us now look back on and say that was far, far, far too much. I mean, this is a Conservative Party, and we cancelled Christmas. I mean, Boris Johnson and Oliver Cromwell, the two national leaders that in our history have cancelled Christmas, and you wouldn't have expected the Venn diagram of Oliver Cromwell and Boris Johnson to have much of a crossover, but yet that happened. So the big takeaway from that is, even when things are really scary, as they were, think very, very carefully about the precedent that you set when you make decisions like that.
And finally, just on a slightly lighter note, for Theresa May, it was fields of wheat. What is the naughtiest thing you've ever done? And don't worry, we won't tell anyone.
Well, I've already fessed up to this. I mean, I've already,
Maybe the second then.
No, I'm not just going to keep listing. I'm going to keep listing indiscretions. What was the euphemism of choice? Was that a normal university experience? Was that the line that Cameron used? Look, I've already fessed up to this. I'm pretty much an open book. So someone, I'm not sure what it is, did one of those dirty dossier things on me. One of those kind of scrape through your past, get all the gossip. And the big things that they came up with was that the business that I started when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister went under, largely because of Gordon Brown's kind of imposition of red tape and that kind of stuff. And I went to a private school. So look, I'm pretty much an open book. And if you want to know the naughtiest things, you can go back and look at John Pinar's podcast from back in 2015.
Okay, we'll do just that. Okay, thank you for joining today, James.